The Red Peri by Stanley Weinbaum. Chapter 1. The Dutch rocket Varken, out of Middelburg, passengers and freight, dropped gingerly toward the mist and cloud-girt earth some 12,000 miles below, underjets cushioning the fall. This last leg of the journey from Venus was the ticklish part of the trip, for the great cigar-shaped rockets, beautifully swift in space, were anything but maneuverable in a strong gravitational field, and Captain Peter ten Eyck had no particular desire to descend in either Central Europe or Mid-Atlantic, to the resultant disgust of the Home Office. He wanted to hit Middelburg in Zealand. Off to the right appeared a very curious shape, visible no more than a quarter of a mile away through the bridge-room port. "Donder!" said Captain ten Eyck feelingly. At the same moment, the annunciator beside him remarked, "Cut your jets." "Aasvogel!" rejoined the captain. "Varken!" His other epithets were somewhat too expressive for permanent record. The apparition against the black sky was swiftly drifting closer. It was distinguishable now as a glittering metal rocket, but in no way like the tapering cylindrical Varken, nor like any other rocket, save one. It was a tubular triangle, from each corner of which rose a strong girder to meet an apex above. In effect, its sides and girders outlined a skeleton tetrahedron, and from the apex of the girders the blue atomic blast flared down to spread fan-like into the space below. As it approached, the strange vessel was dwarfed by the giant freighter. It was no more than 100 feet on a side, and not an eighth the length of the Varken. Again the annunciator uttered its metallic tones. It was responding, apparently, to a beam from the stranger. "Cut your jets," it repeated. "Cut your jets, or we'll top you." Captain ten Eyck ended his mutterings in a heavy sigh. He had no wish to have his vessel exposed to the withering blast of the pirate. He grumbled an order into the box beside him, and the roar of the jets ceased. Whatever maneuverability the lumbering freighter possessed was gone now. There was no longer any chance of ramming the agile attacker. With the cessation of the jets came also complete weightlessness, since they were in a free-fall. But a 12,000-mile free-fall takes considerable time to become serious. Ten Eyck sighed again, ordered the floor magnets on, and waited phlegmatically for further directions. After all, he reflected, his cargo was insured, and Boyd's Marine could afford the indemnity. Besides, Boyd's was an English concern, and he had no mind to risk a good Netherlands ship, and, if he did say it himself, a good Netherlands captain, to save an English insurance company from loss. The door to the bridge room opened. Hawkins, the first officer, clattered in. "What's here?" he shrilled. "The jets are off." He caught sight of the glistening shape beyond the port. "The Red Peri! The blasted pirate!" Captain ten Eyck said nothing, but his pale blue eyes stared moodily at the painted figure plainly visible on the attacker's hull, the figure of a crimson winged imp. He needed no sign to identify the pirate. The queer construction of the vessel was proof enough, for there wasn't another such ship in the sky. The voice sounded again. "Open your airlock." Ten Eyck gave the order and stalked grimly out to receive the boarding party. He heard the thud of the extending gangway as it struck, and the faint grind as the magnet bit to the freighter's hull. There came a brisk pounding on the inner door of the lock. The captain gave the order to open, his voice curiously equable. He was thinking again of the insurance company. Most of the Varken's score of passengers were crowded along the passage. The cutting of the jets, and perhaps the sound of Hawkins' voice from the beam room as he called hopefully for assistance, had apprised all of them of the events, and the glittering triangle of the Red Peri indicated their nature. The lock swung inward, opening upon the steel-ribbed, rubber-sheathed tunnel of the gangway. Figures in spacesuits worn either for disguise or simply as precaution against the possible need of cutting their way in, filed through the circular doorway, automatics and gas guns menacingly visible. There were no words spoken. A dozen buccaneers clanked methodically away toward the aft hold, and one, a slighter figure, stood grimly guarding the lock. In 5 minutes they were filing back, dragging whatever loot they had found, with the queer movement of inertia without weight, much as if they floated the objects through water. Tanich saw the cases of Xixtchil pods, valuable as so many diamonds, disappear into the lock, and the 17 crated ingots of Venusian silver followed. He swore under his breath as he recognized the casket of emeralds from the mines in the Dutch Alps of Venus, and wondered blasphemously how they had managed to crack the Ardekin safe with neither torch nor explosive. Glancing into the purser's office, he saw a queer, jagged hole in the big steel box that looked more as if it had rusted or simply broken away than as if it had been cut. Then the freebooters were silently passing back to their vessel, having neither addressed nor molested officers, crew, or passengers. Except, perhaps, for one. Among the group of watchers was young Frank Keene, American radiologist and physicist, returning from the solar analysis stations at Patrick's Peak in the mountains of eternity. He had edged close to the airlock, and now, as the departing marauders passed through, he suddenly leaned forward with narrowed eyes and peered boldly into the cloudy visor of the guard. "Huh," he said, "a redhead, eh?" The guard said nothing, but raised a steel-gauntleted hand. The metal thumb and forefinger bit viciously into Keene's sun-tanned nose, and he was thrust violently back into the crowd, with 2 spots of blood welling from the abused organ. Keene grunted in pain. "Okay, fellow," he said stolidly. "I'll see you again some day." The guard spoke at last, in a voice that clinked out metallically from the helmet's diaphragm. "When you do, there'd better be 2 of you." Then this figure followed the rest, the outer lock clanged shut, the magnets released the gangway's grip, and the red Peri, agile as a swallow and swift as a comet at perihelion, flared into the black void. Beside Keene sounded the voice of Captain Tanich. "What a ship! Mynheer Keene, is that not a ship, that red Peri?" He was still exclaiming over it at intervals during the laborious task of laying a new landing course, and when, an hour later, a blunt little League rocket appeared in answer to Hawkins' call, he informed its officers flatly that the pirate was hopelessly beyond reach. "Even if your fat beast of a boat could match its acceleration, which it couldn't." A year later, Frank Keene had almost completely forgotten the red Peri and the red-headed pirate, though occasionally, during the interval, mention of the famous marauder had brought his experience to mind. After all, when a freebooter has scoured the skyways for nearly 15 years without capture, he becomes something of a legend, a figure of heroic proportions. Papers and broadcasts give daily references to him, and he is blamed for, or perhaps credited with, many a feat performed by some less celebrated desperado. The lair of the red Peri remained a mystery, though League ships scoured asteroids, the far side of the desolate moon, and even the diminutive satellites of Mars. The swift pirate, striking invariably as his victim inched gingerly through some planet's gravitational field, came and went untouched. But Frank Keene had little time at the moment for consideration of the famous freebooter. He and his companion, 55-year-old Solomon Nestor of the Smithsonian, were out where few men had ever been, and in a predicament that was perhaps unique. They were dropping their rocket, Limbo, toward the rugged black disk of Pluto, 2 billion miles from home, and they were not happy about it. "I tell you," growled Keene, "we've got to land. Do you think I'm settling on this chunk of coal from choice? We've got to make repairs. We can't navigate with one stern jet gone unless you have a notion to fly in circles." Old Solomon was a marvel on hard radiations, stellar chemistry, and astrophysics, but hardly an engineer. He said plaintively, "I don't see why we can't zigzag." "Bah! I told you why. Didn't I spend 5 hours figuring out the time it'd take to reach the nearest inhabited place? That's Titan, near Saturn, just 1 billion, I said, miles from here. And at the speed we could make zigzagging, because we couldn't keep a constant acceleration, it would take us just exactly 4 years and 3 months. We've got food enough for 3 months, but what would we live on during the 4 years? Atomic energy." "But what can we do on Pluto?" queried old Nestor, "and why didn't we carry a spare jet?" "Jets aren't supposed to melt off," muttered Keen disgustedly. "As for what we can do, maybe we can find a virgin deposit of some refractory metal, platinum or iridium or tungsten, or any other with a high melting point, and build up a jet long enough to keep the blast from melting our stern away, because that's what it'll do if we try running it this way." "There's tungsten here," observed the older man, hopefully, gazing down at the black expanse. "Hervey reported it, and so did Kaspari. But there isn't any atmosphere, or rather, what there is liquid or solid, except about half a centimeter's pressure of helium. Pluto has a diameter of about 10,000 miles, a surface gravity of about 1.2, and an albedo—" "Not interested," grunted Keen, and then, relenting, "Listen, Solomon, I'm sorry. I guess I'm taking it out on you because we had a defective jet, but it's a hell of a mess all the same, and somebody's going to suffer for it when we get back. With all the money the Institute has, you'd think they'd be able to afford respectable equipment." He glared down through the floor port. "There she comes." With the rasp and a jar, the limbo came to rest. Outside, a mixed column of dirt and smoke billowed around the glasses, rose, and then settled as quickly as a burst of sand in the near vacuum that surrounded the ship. Keen cut the blast. "Come on," he said, turning to a spacesuit swaying on its hook. "No use wasting time. We'll take a look around." He clambered into the heavy garment, noting irritably its greater weight on the surface of the black planet. The Plutonian gravitation added 36 pounds to its terrestrial 180. "No gun?" asked Nestor. "Gun? For what? This planet's dead as the brain of whoever tested that jet. How can there be organic life in no air and 10 degrees absolute?" He pulled open the inner door of the airlock. "Well," he said, his voice sharply metallic through the helmet's diaphragm, "here goes the Smithsonian expedition for the determination of the intensity of cosmic radiation in extraplanetary space. We determined it all right. Now the only problem of the expedition is to get home with our statistics." He flung open the outer door and stepped out on the black surface of Pluto. So far as Keen knew, he was the 4th man, and Nestor the 5th, to set foot on the black planet. Arsuki, of course, was the first, if one credits his figures and photographs, the intrepid Hervey the 2nd, and Kaspari the 3rd. Here, on this lonely outpost of the solar system, high noon was hardly brighter than full moonlight on Earth, and the queer black surface that gives Pluto its low albedo made it seem still darker. But Keen could distinguish the outlines of fantastic mountains beyond the hollow where the limbo rested, and innumerable mysterious crags and hillocks, unweathered by wind or water, loomed closer. Directly to his right lay a patch of glistening snow-like white, but he knew it wasn't snow, but frozen air. One dared not step in such a drift, for the cold would bite through his insulated spacesuit, since frozen air was a far better conductor of heat than the rocky ground. Overhead glittered all the stars of the galaxy, as changeless as though he stood on a pleasant green planet 2 billion miles sunward, for what was 2 billion miles to the infinite remoteness of the stars? The landscape was bleak, black, desolate, and cold. This was Pluto, the planet that circled the very edge of the system. The two started heavily toward a ridge where something glowed faintly, something that might be virgin metal. Strangely, their own footsteps were audible, for the substance of their spacesuits conducted the sound, but all else was a vast and ominous silence. They did not speak, for their suits, designed only for emergency repairs in space, had no radio, and to communicate it was necessary to touch hand or arm to one's companion. Over such a material bridge, sound traveled easily enough. At the ridge, Keen paused, glowering down at a vein of bright, star-lighted fragments. He placed a hand against Nestor's shoulder. "Peritic," he grunted. "We'll have to look further." He turned right, treading heavily under nearly 60 pounds more than his earth weight. Surely, he mused, old Solomon Nestor wouldn't be capable of an extended search in such circumstances. He frowned. Kaspari had reported great quantities of heavy metals here, and they shouldn't need such a lengthy search. He stopped sharply. A stone came sliding past him on the rocky surface. A signal. Off in the dusk, Nestor was gesturing. Keen turned and hurried back, clambering along the uneven terrains with such haste that his breath shortened and his visor began to cloud. He clapped his hand on the old man's arm. "What is it?" he asked. "Metal?" "Metal? Oh, no." Nestor's voice was triumphant. "What did you say about no organic life on Pluto, eh? Well, what about inorganic life? Look there." Keen looked. Out of a narrow chasm or cleft in the ridge, something moved. For a moment, Keen thought he saw a brook flowing, but a brook, liquid water, was an impossibility on Pluto. He squinted sharply. Crystals. Masses of crystals, gray-white in the dusk, crawling in a slow parade. "I'll be damned," he said. "Kaspari didn't say anything about this." "Don't forget," said Nestor, "that Pluto has 36% more surface than the whole Earth. Not a 10,000th part of it has been explored, probably never will be, because it's such a task to get a rocket here. If Atsuki—" I know, interrupted Keen impatiently, "but these things aren't tungsten or platinum. Let's move on." But he still stared at the crawling, faintly radiant mass. In the silence he heard infinitely faint rustlings, cracklings, and susurrations transmitted through the ground to his feet and thence to his helmet. "What makes them move?" he asked. "Are they alive?" "Alive? I don't know. Crystals are as close as inorganic matter comes to life. They feed, they grow." "But they don't live." Old Solomon Nestor was in his element now. "Well," he proceeded in professorial tones, "what is the criterion of life? Is it movement? No, for wind, water, and fire move, while many living forms do not. Is it growth? No, for fire grows, and so do crystals. Is it reproduction? Again no, for again fire and crystals reproduce themselves if their proper food supply is present. Then just what differentiates dead matter from living?" "That's what I'm asking you," snapped Keen. "And I'm telling you, there's just one, or perhaps two, criteria. First, living things show irritation, and second, and more important, they show adaptation." "Eh?" "Listen," continued Nestor. "Fire moves, grows, feeds, and reproduces, doesn't it? But it doesn't run away from water. It doesn't betray the irritation life shows in the presence of a poison, though water's poison to it. Any living thing that encounters poison makes an attempt to throw it off. It develops antibodies, or fever, or it ejects the poisonous matter. Sometimes it dies, of course, but it tries to survive. Fire doesn't. As for adaptation, does fire ever make a voluntary attempt to reach its food? Does it deliberately flee from its enemies? Even the lowest form of life known does that. Even the miserable amoeba makes positive gestures of adaptation to its environment." Keen stared more closely at the sluggish crystalline stream, which was now impinging on the black plain at his feet. He bent over it, and suddenly perceived a fact that had hitherto escaped him. "Look here," he said, touching old Solomon's arm. "These things are organisms. They're not loose crystals, but masses of them." It was true. The rustling crystals moved in glittering chunks from thumbnail size to aggregations as large as dogs. They crackled and rustled along, apparently moving by a slow shifting of the lower crystals, much as a snake moves on its scaly belly, but far stiffer and slower. Abruptly, Keen sent his metal boot crashing into one. It shattered with a blue flash of released static electricity, and the pieces passively resumed their progress. "They certainly don't show irritation," he remarked. "But look!" shrilled Nestor. "They do show adaptation. There's one feeding." He pulled Keen a few feet down the ridge. There was a small bluish deposit of something that looked like frozen clay, a product, perhaps, of the infinitely remote past when Pluto's own heat had maintained liquid water and gaseous air to grind its rocks to powder. A crystalline mass had paused at the edge, and before their gaze it was growing, gray-white crystals springing out of it as frost spreads over a winter-chilled window-pane. "It's an aluminum eater!" shrieked Nestor. "The crystals are alums! It's eating the clay!" Keen was far less excited than old Solomon, perhaps because he was considerably more practical. "Well," he said decisively, "we can't waste any more time here. We need refractory metal, and we need it bad. You try along the ridge, and I'll cross over." He broke off suddenly, staring appalled at the foot with which he had shattered the moving crystals. On its surface glittered a spreading mass of tiny, sparkling points. A break in the surface of his spacesuit meant death, for the oxygen generator could certainly never maintain its pressure against any appreciable leakage. He bent over, scraping desperately at the aluminum feeders, and then realized that the infection had spread to his gauntlets. While Nestor babbled futilely and inaudibly behind his visor, Keen rubbed his hands in the gritty peritic soil on which he stood. That seemed to work. The rough substance scoured away the growing crystals, and with frantic vigor he rasped a handful along his shoe. If only no hole, no tiniest pinprick, had opened. He scoured furiously, and at last the metal surface showed scratched and pitted, but free of the growths. He stood up unsteadily and placed his hand against the gesturing Nestor's side. "Keep away from them," he gasped. "They eat." Keen never finished his sentence. Something hard jarred against the back of his armor. A metallic voice clicked. "Stand still, both of you."